How can a sixth place stagger the foundations of a giant like Ferrari? Lewis Hamilton achieved what seemed impossible. With a comeback from the 10th position, he left everyone in Maranello speechless and caused a technical storm that nobody saw coming. What exactly did the engineers discover? And why this result, which seems normal, could be the beginning of something much bigger? Stay, because what we will reveal will change your way of seeing this season. Thus arrived in Monza, the Temple of Speed, the Italian motorsport cathedral, the scenario where idols are enshrined or fall. For Hamilton, this Grand Prix had a tremendous symbolic burden. It was his first time competing with Ferrari against the Tifosi at home, with all the emotional and sports pressure that implies. But the context did not favor him. He came from a penalty in the previous race that forced him to leave from the 10th position. A condemnation in a circuit to advance is not a simple task, and where the errors are paid expensive. However, from free training, something began to gestate. Hamilton and his engineer began working in a different, more aggressive configuration, more targeted at peak speed than curve control. It was an approach that bet everything on the performance in the race, sacrificing the classification. A calculated risk. And most importantly, for the first time, Ferrari's technical team really listened to him. Not as a star that arrives with demands, but as a pilot who deeply understands the car, which provides specific solutions and can run under pressure. Sunday's race, therefore, was not just a matter of adding points. It was a kind of public trial. Was it worth signing Hamilton? Could you really adapt to Ferrari's DNA? Or would it be another failed experiment like as many in the last decade? All those questions floated in the air when the traffic lights went out. And what happened later left everyone literally speechless. What seemed like a good recovery career for Lewis Hamilton became a technical enigma within Maranello. The sixth place in Monza did not raise suspicions outside the paddock, but within the Ferrari team he unleashed an analysis storm that still generates consequences. Because what the data revealed was not a casual improvement, but a radical transformation of the SF25, exclusively in Hamilton. At the end of the race, engineers began the usual telemetric review. They expected to see data similar to those obtained by Leclerc, or at least consistent with the history of the car throughout the season. But instead, what they found was something completely unexpected. The SF25, a car that had behaved like an erratic machine in medium and fast curves, had shown a balance never seen during Hamilton's driving. Not only was it more stable, it was almost surgical in its power delivery, in its traction at the exit of critical curves, in its aerodynamic efficiency under load. One of the key points was the Lesmo 2. Traditionally, this sector had been a nightmare for Ferrari. In 2024, even with a competitive car like the SF24, the data showed considerable losses against Red Bull and McLaren. But in Monza 2025, Hamilton was not only faster than his teammate, but in certain sectors matched, and at times he exceeded the RB21 records of Verstappen. A fact that forced the team to stop everything and rethink the interpretation they had from the car. What had done different Hamilton? The answer was not only in his natural ability, but in a combination of technical decisions that he had pushed. Starting with the aerodynamic package, Ferrari arrived in Monza with a rear wing of ultra-low load, recovering elements inspired by the model of the previous year. This configuration had been initially discarded by its instability on other tracks. But Hamilton insisted on trying it, arguing that, with a precise adjustment of the differential and a more rigid rear suspension, he could turn that apparent weakness into a strategic advantage. The theory was risky. In a circuit where every kilometer per hour in line counts, sacrificing aerodynamic load could be seen as madness. But Hamilton had a plan. During free practices, he worked intensely with his track engineer to adapt not only the general balance of the car, but also control parameters that are rarely modified without a deep analysis. The electronic differential, for example, was specifically recalibrated to offer greater freedom when entering curve and a more aggressive blockade at the exit. This configuration is usually reserved for pilots with great sensitivity to the grip limit, and Hamilton not only handled it, he perfected it. In parallel, he requested subtle adjustments on the front wing flaps and in the roke of the car, the inclination between the front and rear axle, to optimize the airflow under the SF25, minimizing the drag without compromising the braking stability. But the most surprising was his intuition to identify that the car's behavior was not linear. He reacted differently according to the type of curve. And instead of asking for a universal solution, Hamilton segmented the car mentally by circuit sectors, adapting its piloting to each punctual behavior. The data confirmed this theory. While Leclerc had oscillations in the time delta between sectors, Hamilton's records showed an almost millimeter consistency. Every lap, every traction, each braking, was like a perfect repetition. That had never happened with SF25. And it was there that the engineers realized the problem was not just the car. It was of interpretation, reading, execution. Hamilton had deciphered the car in a way that no pilot before, even in the simulator, had achieved. And the most ironic thing was that the motor mapping chosen by Hamilton, far from being the most aggressive, was one of the most conservative. Its efficiency did not come due to gross power, but by mechanical refinement. Reduced the use of the hybrid system in unnecessary sections to avoid overheating, and dosed its electrical energy just where the SF25 generated its largest drag. That management, invisible to the outer eye, was essential to maintain its career rhythm without degrading the tires beyond the critical threshold. When all these data were presented to the Ferrari Technical Committee, the reaction was astonished. It was not simply that Hamilton had had a good day. It was that, under his hands, the SF25 had behaved like a completely different car. More competitive, more consistent, more efficient. And that forced an awkward question. Had the car been developing in the wrong direction? When Ferrari's engineering team finished analyzing Lewis Hamilton data in Monza, the general sensation was not euphoria. It was confusion. Because what represented that 6th place went beyond the points obtained or the simple fact of having traced from the 10th position. It was the finding that there was enormous potential in the SF25, hidden until that moment. And the most disturbing thing for Maranello was that this potential did not arise from a natural evolution of the car or a planned improvement. It was triggered by a human variable, the intervention of a pilot who dared to drive differently, to suggest unpopular changes and break with the technical inertia that had been marking the development of the car from the preseason. In other words, what had transformed SF25 in Monza was not a miraculous aerodynamic package. It was Hamilton's ability to force the car to behave as it should, even when the team itself had stopped believing that it was possible. And this is where the true internal tension within Ferrari begins. Because until now, the entire development approach was focused on Charles Leclerc's pilot style. From the motor maps to the philosophy of setup, everything was designed to maximize the confidence of Monegasco, which historically has needed a very stable rear train and a predictable direction to squeeze its rhythm. Leclerc is fast, very fast, but also dependent on a platform that does not surprise you. Hamilton, on the other hand, is a pilot who builds his performance on controlled chaos. Throughout his career, he has shown an almost unique capacity to adapt to unpredictable cars, to work in limit conditions and to exploit variables such as differential or hybrid system in his favor. And that showed it in Monza. The SF25 in his hands behaved as a completely different car. And that raises an awkward question. Was Ferrari developing the car for the wrong pilot? Because if the car performance is unlocked only with a radical technical approach, then Ferrari has a capital dilemma. Continue to bet on the conservative way of Leclerc, or reorient the entire technical program towards the characteristics that best adapt to Hamilton, even if that means bothering its star pilot of recent years. It is an unprecedented situation in the Italian team. Never before in the hybrid era they had had two pilot styles so different living in parallel, and even less with the pressure of fighting for a championship that seemed within reach in preseason but now complicates. And not just that. What happened in Monza also reconfigures the technical hierarchy within the team. Because much of the changes that worked in the car came from Hamilton's direct suggestions during free training. His meticulous approach, his return track reading, his feedback in real time, all that allowed refined parameters that Ferrari had ignored or considered irrelevant. From the gearbox mapping to the distribution of dynamic braking, many of the successful adjustments came not from the simulator, but from the instinct and experience of the British. And now the big question, can this technical and conceptual change sustain itself throughout the season? Was Monza an isolated case, favored by the characteristics of the circuit, or are we facing Ferrari's real turning point? The answer will actually depend on two factors. First, of the humility of the team to accept that their assumptions were wrong. And second, of Hamilton's ability to replicate this circuit performance with different aerodynamic demands. And that's where Hamilton once again becomes dangerous. You don't need the car faster to impact. You don't need to be in pole to master the conversation. It is enough for a track with a weekend with a curve drawn perfectly to rewrite the story. He has done it before. He does it again. And this time he makes him dressed in red. The 2025 season just begins and has already been shaken by a result that should not have imported, but that changes everything. If Monza was only the first chapter of this new version of Hamilton, then the true championship is not decided on career Sundays. It is decided between lines of code in telemetry, in setup decisions under pressure, in the silent understanding between a pilot and his machine. And if that is true, if Ferrari's future depends on his ability to understand what happened in Monza, then we just witnessed more than a simple career. We have just seen the birth of a new narrative,